Hi everybody, I hope you're all doing really well. Back today to talk about my best books of 2024. I cannot believe that we are all the way around through another year and right back at the beginning again. Where did the time go? I don't know. But this is my favourite video to do in any given year, looking back on the past 12 months and picking out the best of the best, the books that really stood out to me and made me just remember why it is that I love reading so very much. So without much further ado, let's just get straight into these 10 fantastic books. First off, starting with non-fiction history, we have Bluestockings, The First Women's Movement by Susannah Gibson. This is a book which is looking at the early to mid 18th century, looking at some of the intellectual pioneering women who would host these literary salons in their homes to encourage deep thought and reflection, and were massive influences on the women who would come after them, influencing the likes of Mary Wollstonecraft, Jane Austen, Virginia Woolf. A lot of people, when they talk about the Bluestockings, are referring to 19th and 20th century intellectual women, but these women are where that term was first coined, and particularly at this time period, an intellectual woman was seen as somehow deviant, definitely transgressing societal norms, and these women were setting out to prove that that wasn't true, that an intellectual woman could be just as proper and respectable as any man who was given the same opportunity. And that's really the thread that runs through this book, is how these women were really fighting to showcase their respectability, the great things that they were able to achieve, but also the more negative aspects of their movement, particularly when it came to their fairly brutal treatment, when it came to handling their own among any scandals that might break out, how these women could be pretty ruthless and unforgiving if somebody were to transgress. And that's what I really love about this book, is that it is not afraid to depict these women and their many moral complexities, the ways that they were very ahead of their time, but also where they were very much women of their time, and all that that implies. This book is looking at each of these women, from Elizabeth Montagu to Hester Frail, Fanny Burney, Anne Yeasley, Catherine Macaulay, going backwards and forwards through these women's biographies, how they would each have an impact on each other and on the wider intellectual landscape. This was a topic that I studied during my masters and I thought was so interesting and engaging. I was so surprised that there wasn't a popular history about them, and now a few years later we actually have it, and I'm so glad that this is in my life. Next up we have A Lady's Guide to Scandal by Sophie Irwin. Back in 2022 I read Sophie Irwin's first book, which was A Lady's Guide to Fortune Hunting, and really enjoyed that. I was really getting into my Regency romance, and now here we have a different story with a new protagonist, Eliza, who has recently been widowed. Many years ago she was married off to a much older man who she didn't love for financial gain. One of the major downsides to this being that she actually ended up refusing a man that she was truly in love with in order to fulfill her family's wishes. Now she is a widow and she has unexpectedly been given quite a large inheritance that she didn't expect to pick up, but there is a condition from the will on this fortune. Eliza has to make sure that she keeps her head down, behaves, and stays away from any whiff of scandal. Otherwise the fortune that she has inherited is going to revert straight back to the family. Eliza and her cousin Margaret decide that she is going to wait out the rest of her official mourning period in Bath, reintegrate herself into society as a respectable widow. However, while she is trying to improve her lot in Bath, who should she stumble upon but the new Count of Somerset, who has taken over her deceased husband's seat, and who is also the man that she had previously jilted. Eliza is so very sure that he is out to get her, that he has not forgiven her for how she treated him in their past, and so is very surprised that he is actually incredibly attentive to her and is not quite sure how to handle this. Not only this, but there is another male figure who has come into her life, a very charismatic but particularly scandalous writer who seems to be flaring Eliza's imagination and is maybe making it so that scandal is not so far away as she may think. I really loved this story about a woman coming into her own in her late 20s, being given a second chance at life. It is, like many Regency romances, quite sweet, quite gentle. You know that it is going to end well, but there are also twists and turns in this story that I didn't necessarily see coming. I love the character work in here. Sophie Irwin with this kind of love triangle, making it so that you truly don't know until a good like 2/3 of the way through the book who it is that Eliza should be going for, and even when you decide who the right man is for her, whether or not she's even going to get him in the end. Many people criticize romance for being quite predictable, but I found actually the opposite with this. I loved how imperfect Eliza is as a protagonist coming into her own. She doesn't suddenly make a resolution that she is going to change her life and then the whole way through is acting upon it in a perfect linear way. She has stops and starts. She has times where she doubts herself, and that doesn't make her a weak character. It just makes her very real and very flawed and relatable. And I love the female friendship between Eliza and her cousin Margaret, who would really keep her down to earth, and especially Margaret bringing her down to earth on how privileged a position that she is in. Anytime that Eliza would really start to doubt herself and try and wallow, Margaret would always be there to pull her out, give her a gentle nudge in the right direction, and realise how good she has got it and not to waste the opportunities that are there for her. Brilliant book, especially if you are somebody who likes a bit of romance but doesn't really enjoy a spicy scene, then this is one that I think you might want to check check out. Staying on with the Regency, we have a non-fiction, and it is Love and Marriage in the Age of Jane Austen by Rory Muir. A fantastic non-fiction book going from courtship and the early days of attraction through to weddings, marriage, children and widowhood in the late 18th to early 19th centuries, the conventions of the day in Regency society and how it would have influenced on Jane Austen and her writing. What I love about this book is that even though it does invoke the name Jane Austen, Rory Muir is not actually super reliant on Jane Austen's texts in order to inform his work. Actually, it is made up so much more of actual documented primary evidence, letters, newspapers, advice columns of the day, diary entries, to really give an insight into how people would have thought about love and marriage in this period. And also dispelling a lot of myths about how happy Regency marriages would have been. I think a lot of people think of marriage in this time period being very unhappy, but in here he is showing much more of a balanced perspective. There's so much research in this book, but you're never too bogged down with it. He still keeps it entertaining and engaging, and I think if you're a fan of Jane Austen, if you're a fan of Bridgerton or other Regency romances, then this is a really good non-fiction to sink your teeth into and really illuminate a bit more about this time period that we all love. Moving on to some historical fiction in a different time period, now we're looking at the late medieval period, we have The King's Mother by Annie Garthwaite. This is her second novel looking at the life of Cecily Neville, who was wife to Richard, Duke of York, and mother to two kings, Edward IV and Richard III. The first book was looking at her marriage to Richard and how she navigated court life through the early fighting in the Wars of the Roses, her reaction to Richard's death in battle, and it ended with her son Edward taking the throne. This book carries on from that moment all the way through to the end of her life. We are seeing the later period of the Wars of the Roses, the tensions and conflicts in Edward's reign, his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville and the court reactions to that, the rise of Margaret Beaufort, the death of Edward IV and Richard III taking the throne from his nephew, and then culminating in the Battle of Bosworth, where Cecily sees her last remaining son Richard being killed in battle, and the new Tudor dynasty under Henry VII and Margaret Beaufort taking their place. It was really interesting reading this book and wanting to see how Annie Garthwaite would treat this history, how balanced she would be in her perspective, particularly of Cecily and Richard. You know, definitely, admittedly, as myself, I am not a Ricardian. You know, cards on the table, I do think that he sent the order to have the princes in the tower executed. I just, you know, other people will put out their theories of who might have done it, what might have happened to the two boys, and I don't see any other way. I don't think it is that feasible, and that is not the tack that this book is taking. And it was really surprising to me while reading this book. I knew that I really enjoyed her depiction of Cecily. I was not expecting to enjoy the depiction of Richard quite so much, because with my own preconceived notions of Richard in my mind, I'm predicting that she was probably not going to take this down the route of Richard ordering the princes to be executed. You know, it wouldn't have made sense with the characterization that she has of Richard to do so. I was expecting to therefore find her depiction of him to be kind of grating to me, but actually I thought it was really balanced. She sticks to her guns, she sticks to her characterization, but just because she is making Cecily and Richard more sympathetic, it doesn't therefore mean that her depictions of Henry Tudor or Margaret Beaufort are villainized in any way. I was so incredibly surprised by that, because I read so much historical fiction where you are definitely meant to come down on one of two sides, where one person is raised up in order to put another person down. I feel like she was able to handle this complicated time period that can be so controversial, where everybody has their opinions about it, and treating it in an even-handed manner while still having a point of view, as well as cramming in so much amazing historical detail that never bogged down the story, being able to keep a really quick pace with this book and get through a lot of history while still giving these characters room to breathe, personalities to shine, and having these complicated historical figures really brought to life. I really feel like she stuck the landing with this sequel. Next up, staying with medieval historical fiction, we have The Good Wife of Bath by Karen Brooks. In this, Karen Brooks is aiming to depict who the wife of Bath might have been if she actually existed in Chaucer's timeline, the woman behind this figure in the Canterbury Tales. And she does so through the character of Eleanor. And we start with her as a young rebellious girl at age 12 being married off to a much older man, and despite all of her setbacks, being able to carve a life out for herself, being a very business savvy woman and striving to improve herself and improve her lot in a time period that didn't give her many options. I love this main character of Eleanor, who, as I say, is incredibly witty, savvy, not always the nicest person, but you definitely understand why people flock to her, the charm and the charisma that she has. I loved reading about her friendship to Geoffrey Chaucer, the camaraderie that they share, but also how that camaraderie is broken when later in the book our Eleanor discovers that he has been writing about her, has taken her life and fictionalized it and kind of made her feel like the butt of a joke. How that would disrupt her friendship of so many years. It's a very brutal landscape that Karen Brooks is depicting of 14th century Europe, and really throughout the book it never does quite let up. up, the reliance on elements out of your control, whether that is nature, disease, the will of other people who have far more control and power than you will ever have. But the ways that Eleanor keeps her head up and keeps striving for more for her life while also keeping her basic humanity and decency intact. It's just a very inspiring story, and one that I'm very glad that I've read this year. Next up, time travelling to World War I, we have In Memoriam by Alice Winn. This was one of the very first books that I read at the beginning of the year, and it just broke my heart. So in this, we are following best friends Henry Gaunt and Sydney Elwood. We meet them in the private boarding school that they attended at the outbreak of World War I. We know that both boys are in love with the other, but due to the time that they are living in, the illegality of their love, and should anybody discover it, and also neither one wanting to rock the boat, neither one wanting to be rejected by the other, they keep their feelings hidden. Their relationship is plunged into turmoil as Henry ends up enlisting for the war on account of his German heritage, making his family look suspicious and him wanting to divert attention away. Sydney ends up enlisting soon after, and the two are plunged into the realities and brutalities of war. We are brought right alongside them in the trenches, having to face just the unrelenting horrors of this war. This book particularly focuses on men's mental health, the different ways that people would react to the war. It does not shy away from injury detail and pretty gory descriptions of what happens to a person's body on a battlefield. So definitely a warning for you going into this. It is a lot, it is incredibly intense, but I do think it feels more real for all of that. She goes through the two boys, and then as they grow up into men, their two perspectives, the different things that they see, their reactions to it. And I always think it's a skill of a writer when each perspective is just as interesting as the other. Her way of feeding you little breadcrumbs of their stories so that you always want to go back for more. She really knows how to leave you on a cliffhanger. It is just such a poignant, devastating story where you never know what's going to happen next, who you might lose next, and one that I can't believe I waited until this year to finally read. Another book that I picked up at the beginning of this year on a recommendation from so many people's best of 2023 book videos was Foster by Claire Keegan. This is finally the year that I was introduced to Claire Keegan, and once again, oh my goodness, how have I not read her until now? In Foster, we have our young unnamed protagonist, a young girl who has been sent to live with a foster family, with the imminent arrival of a new sibling making her parents just feel very overwhelmed and just needing to offload at least one child from their plates for the next few weeks. She's sent to live with the Kinslers, and while she is very shy and reserved at the beginning of this book, through their very warm, affectionate treatment of her, she is starting to see what life is like in a home where she is allowed the freedom to grow and to be herself, where she is being given unconditional love and support, which it is very clear that she has not had in her family home, which means it's all the more devastating as you get to the end of the book and you know that this can only go one way. She is eventually going to have to be sent home to her parents and snap back into a family situation which is much colder, much less loving, and your heart just breaks for this little girl. What I've noticed through my reading of Claire Keegan this year is that she is just a master of writing in such a clean, crisp way where there is no word out of place, not a single word is wasted on the page, and yet she is able to flesh out so much of these characters and the rural Irish landscape in so few pages. It's really just an amazing thing to behold. And because it's so short, once I finished this the first time, I went right back to the beginning and read it again. That's how good this is. Absolutely brilliant book, definitely one that you should pick up, and it's going to take you no time at all, so you have no excuses. Next up, a book that I was pretty sure I was going to love and yet was still so delighted when that turned out to be true was The Trouble with Mrs Montgomery, Hurst by Katie Lumsden. I had previously read Katie's first book, The Secrets of Hartwood Hall, last year. That ended up on my best books of 2023 list, and with the setting and the premise of this one being Jane Austen meets Elizabeth Gaskell, you've got this very Cranford-like town where everybody is gossiping and in each other's business. I was pretty sure I was going to like this even more, and yep, that turned out to be true. I absolutely adored this book. So this book is set in this fictional county of Wickenshire, where everybody is shocked to discover that the very eligible Mr Montgomery Hurst has been recently married to a widow of no importance who even has her own children from her previous marriage. This man was such a hot commodity, kind of the prize of the marriage market in this fictional county. Everybody was wanting to throw their daughters at him, and yet he married this woman. Why? And so the gossip mill, of course, as it always does, runs amok. Everybody is coming up with their own theories, justifications for why this might have been. Everybody is getting into their business. And so this is basically a patchwork quilt of this gossipy Greek chorus of a town. But we're getting to see more of these individual characters' lives and their troubles, and what else is going on in their lives outside of this controversy. Once again, this is a masterclass in characterization. In this book, Katie is having to juggle so many different characters and their points of view, and manages to make each character come to life and feel very real real. You do have your heroes and your villains in here, but nobody feels like a two-dimensional figure. Everyone has their own things going on, their own trouble, so even if you don't like everybody, you still understand them. Every time I pick up Katie's books, I'm just hit by why it is that I love historical fiction so much. The aspects of these time periods that these authors are able to invoke that maybe a writer who was actually living in the 19th century wouldn't have been able to do, whether that was more of a realistic look at class, at the impact of gossip, different scandals and taboos that people are able to talk about now, but would have been unacceptable in the 19th century. Yes, I heartily enjoyed this one, and definitely one that I think that you should all pick up, because not only is it a fantastic book, but you're also getting to support one of BookTube's very own. So no excuses, definitely one for you to pick up in 2025 if you haven't already. But an ultimate book that I'm going to talk to you about today is one that I've actually not talked about either individually or in a wrap-up on my channel, which is so surprising because, as you can tell from this video, this is like my second favourite of the year, so definitely shame on me, but it is The Instrumentalist by Harriet Constable. This is a fictionalisation of the real-life Anna Maria della Pieta, who was an orphan who was dropped off at the Ospedale della Pieta, a Venetian orphanage in which young girls were trained up as musicians. We find out very quickly that she is a bit of a violin prodigy. People really take notice of her playing, and she ends up catching the eye of the new tutor there, Antonio Vivaldi, the composer, who we know now for his compositions, particularly the Four Seasons. We follow her through her early life up to her mid-teens, the fraught nature of her position in this orphanage, her having to battle her way up the ranks to prove herself to be the best musician here, especially because the risk is so high. If she does not prove herself, she may be cast away. You see her incredibly close, very intense relationship with Vivaldi, and then have to witness her devastation as she realises that Vivaldi is actually stealing her compositions and passing them off for his own. The atmosphere that Harriet Constable is able to depict in this book is so intense. It's a very restricted, claustrophobic environment, and yet you feel this orphanage is an entire world. I love her depiction of Anna Maria's obsession with music, the way that she's able to see notes as various colours. The only thing that I can think of that is comparable is, you know how Remy in Ratatouille is able to visualise the different tastes of food? That is the only way that I can describe it, but it's so beautifully done. Once again, Anna Maria is an incredibly ambitious, very inspirational figure, but she's also, because she is so competitive, means that she grows to be quite comfortable with stepping over other people on her way to the top. She's not always a particularly nice figure due to her very obsessive nature about her music, and so she is frustrating, but you're always rooting for her. You always want her to do well. And I think especially any book that makes me want to obsessively listen to classical music afterwards has definitely done something right. Then the final book that I want to talk to you about today is actually a sequel. It is the last book in a trilogy, so I don't know how much of this I can really talk about without giving too many spoilers, but my recommendation of this is generally a recommendation for the entire trilogy, which I have read over time, which is The Temple of Fortuna by Elodie Harper, the third and final book in the Wolf Den trilogy. This series we have been following the main character of Amara, who at the very beginning of the Wolf Den was a sex worker working in the brothels in Pompeii, known as the Wolf Den. She is a character who has very little control over her life, being sold off to various men by the pimp Felix, and through that first book she is striving to ensure her freedom, not just for herself, but for the other women in the Wolf Den. She's an incredibly intelligent, astute woman who is able to use her gifts, particularly her beautiful speaking voice and her skill at business, to make herself indispensable to the various men that frequent the Wolf Den. By the time we get to the Temple of Fortuna, Amara's life is incredibly different. We've seen her really grow through the course of the 3 books, but in this book we're really seeing how all of the choices that she made in the previous 2 books have really left an impact and a mark on her, and how the more that you grow in power, the more dismissive she is of the people lower down, but also how much further to fall she has. In the midst of this, we are in 79 AD, we are in Pompeii, so you know what that means. Vesuvius is going to make its mark on this story. And I have to say, if you were reading this and you were thinking it was pretty slow, by the time you get to the Vesuvius chapters, it is just non-stop. It does not let up. It is genuinely the most exhilarating reading experience that I had all year reading the last half of this book. I just didn't want to put it down. It was so compulsive, so terrifying. I really felt like I was in the midst of this eruption with the other characters. And you realise that the slow pace that this book has at the beginning, where Amara is going from each different character that we have known and either loved or hated in the other books, they are really getting their swan song there for many of them, at last chance to really shine as either the great characters that they are or the horrible characters that they are. It was just a breathtaking book, and has just ensured that I am going to read whatever Elodie Harper comes out with next. I believe her next book is coming out in August, and it is all about Boudica's daughter. I am very much anticipating this, but I'm just so sad that this series is over. As much as she was able to close it out very well, there were still a few questions that I had at the end of it that I would love to get the answers to. But overall, a very, very satisfying conclusion to a fantastic trilogy. So there we go. Those are my top 10 books of 2024. I do think 2024 was a fantastic reading year. Very, very happy with the book selection that I have for you. Please let me know if you've read any of the books that I've spoken to you about today. Did you enjoy them? Did any of these make it onto your top books of the year? Alternatively, please let me know about any of your best books of 2024. Anything that I should add to my reading list for 2025, I would love to hear from you. I hope you're having a fantastic, fantastic day. I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks. Bye.